There's one inmate here, his name is Jesse. Jesse fathered 3 children in there that we know of. Pack a picnic. Bring your family to the state pen. Enjoy a nice hanging. Well.
Hey everybody, today we're at the West Virginia Penitentiary. And as you can see on the sign, it's from 1866 and it closed down in 1995. Some say this place is very haunted and it's very active in there. So we're gonna check it out and you should pay attention and see if you see any sightings while we're in there. You can even sleep here overnight. What do you think about that, Brett? You want to stay here overnight?
I'm not about it. I'll just listen to the editorials afterwards.
Oh, come on. You think something's gonna get you?
It might.
You think one of the prisoners is still here?
I'm sure many of them are.
I don't know. I think it's gonna be pretty cool. So come on, let's go.
Otherwise, and I was just telling them now is the best time for bathrooms because we will be out there about 90 minutes, give or take, about an hour and a half hike.
Okay.
So, sure enough. Y'all are ready? We'll do it to it, make it official.
I'm ready.
Okay.
So ready.
It's like the visitation.
Now,
Visitation.
if you all get a chance to check out where this bridge is located, that's down in Fayetteville, West Virginia. That is the 63rd National Park, the River Gorge National Park. That was painted by inmate Danny Lehman, and he was through that part of the state. Just gorgeous part of the state if y'all ever get a chance to see it. And I'll admit I'm a little biased because where I grew up is about 5 minutes from that bridge. So
I've been over that bridge actually, the New River Gorge Bridge. They have Bridge Day once a year. They jump from it.
yeah, they forecasted about 85 degrees today, so it's you feel that muscles it's working on. I just had about 40 school kids earlier before y'all got here, so I've already worked up my fair share of sweat for the day.
How bad do you think it's going to be overnight?
Overnight, shouldn't be too bad.
All right.
The prison is still slowly acclimating to the warmth. It's still a little bit cool.
Okay.
And once the warmth settles in, it'll be this way till about October.
All right. Okay.
Be comfortable. This area right here, this is what we call Main Street. This was back in the day known as the 9-8 corridor. That was the radio call sign for this area. Basically the main thoroughfare connecting the new south end to the older north end, and that's where we'll spend most of the time, which is the Civil War era side. That was all built by the first men to arrive here from 1866 to 1899. Now, the only problem was they only built that side of the prison to house about 800 inmates. Well, in the late 1930s, they had over 2,700 inmates. The cells over there are 5 by 7. There were 3 men living in each one. And when you see these cells, it will blow your mind. It was not a long-term plan. So that's why later, starting in 1929, they realized they needed more prison, right? So inmates started building this side, basically from that wall south. Well, October that year, when the Great Depression began, Congress passed a law you couldn't hire an inmate for work. So slow construction efforts down quite a bit, let alone the Depression itself, and World War II and the Korean conflicts, not the steadiest flow of supplies. So it took the crews 30 years until 1959 to finish all this. Now your mainline general population inmates, about 600 of them, live down the hall in Newwall, and that'll be our final stop. And I mention that now because those are your run-of-the-mill convict. You know, their convictions are everywhere from minor drug convictions to multiple murder convictions. The housing unit we'll be visiting first over on the older side is the North Hall. And that was segregation, or in layman's terms, the jail inside of the penitentiary for the guys who were causing trouble over here. Those guys are being punished, so they're locked down 22 and a half hours a day in their cell. So it's preferable to be over here at mainline or general population. During mass movements of inmates, you would have hundreds of guys coming up through here at times like a herd of cattle. You had one officer in here with a weapon, firearm, and you got one officer in here with a radio. And they're really putting their safety in that officer's hands. If there was anything that went on in here, the idea was that that officer could protect him or her. The problem is, you take a look at that porthole where the rifle would slip through, you can't see most of the people in this hallway. Let alone the size of the windows, again, you can't see most of the people in this hallway. At times, they would move them on the inside of that red line if they felt the security level, if the threat level was high, something was about to happen. They'd have to walk with one hand on the wall, the other hand on the inmate's shoulder in front of them. They'd have to look down, not speak, not break form, because once more, that red line lines up with that gun hole. So anytime they did have to move them like that real tight, they were told if they crossed that line to shoot them. If the inmate kept moving, they'd shoot him again. I was told by one of the older officers that that did happen in here, but they haven't told us exactly how many times. You imagine even something as small as a 22 going off in here, how loud that would be. They were dealing with 12 gauges and 308s in here, so pretty loud. So the corner up here, there's a little rise in the floor, just kind of watch your step. And one of the main reasons the prison closed in 1995 was, you know, the penitentiary was just designed and laid out the way prisons used to operate 150 plus years ago. One of those things that comes with that is blind spots like that. That officer, the 9/8 gun officer, had line of sight to here. The captain's office behind this wall, the captain had a line of sight north. Just notice how this area right here is blind spot. This was known by the inmates as a hot spot. During many mass movements either way, a lot of guys got stuck right there. So.
Pretty neat.
Yeah, this area here has served the prison for 3 separate purposes.
Wow.
The first 2 purposes, it's going to take more imagination for you to make sense of it. Picture the log cabin wall gone and the mountain mural wall gone. This first floor area, about 250 feet north, was wide open. Ceiling used to be about 1 floor higher, and the reason for that is this was the first cell block, what we call the old South Hall cell block. Again, it's hard to picture, but this is 4 tiers high, 240 5x7 iron cells, and so it's massive. Went way up, and that's why you'll notice the windows continue on above the new 2nd floor. But this old South Hall cell block would also contain what few death row cells they had back before 1965 when they abolished capital punishment. 1968, they tore this cell block out, partly because they had 2 riots that same year, and the inmates created a lot of damage in here. So they tore all this out. They converted this lower level into a massive dining hall that could feed about 300 at a time if they had to. They installed the new medical floor upstairs, that psych units above us, infirmaries on the north end. And that's why we have a gun cage. So you would have had an officer in here with a shotgun watching the guys as they eat. The window right there was a pill window. Usually blood pressure and psych meds was prescribed to the men. Usually they had to take those with food. Well, here's the only thing. This dining hall and kitchen would have put Stephen King films to shame. And what I mean by that is this was infested with healthy meat-eating prison rats that looked like small dogs, little possums. They'd run around while they're eating, sometimes running away with their food. Inmates who cooked and served the food were never given hairnets or gloves, so truth be told, God knows what they're eating, you know. I mean, fingernails, hair, dead skin. At home, I've got reports of roaches cooked in the potatoes. It was just terrible. Mice in the ceiling here, when they die, flies come in, and not just inmates, but officers have told me it was not uncommon at times to witness maggots fall from the drop towel, lantern, or whatever they were eating. Hard to imagine all that in totality. It's not hard to imagine a lot of riots here. And where you are standing in the old mess hall is where the last riot started. It's the most violent to this day in state history. The New Year's Day riot of 1986. It was always a New Year's Day tradition. Officers would call in sick on New Year's Day. Well, truth be told, they were drinking a little bit too much, or they wanted to keep drinking. And over the years, inmates became aware of this tradition. They came to expect it. 86 was no different. They had about almost 20 officers call in sick from the 3 to 11 evening shift. It put them well below critical level of staffing. They should have locked the prison down. It didn't happen. Everything fell into place. About 5:30 that evening, again, you had a couple hundred guys in here. Captain Pat and Officer Littell is standing over near the column, and the door is broken open by a group of about 20 inmates. That was the initial onslaught, so to speak. They're armed with shanks, their homemade weapons. Captain Pat and Officer Littell were taken hostage at knife point. Within 15 minutes, they ended up with 16 total hostages, and about 200 inmates had control of most of the prison for the following 52 hours. They took 3 inmates who they considered snitches and child molesters, and they brutally murdered them. The problem was, for years at this point, inmates have been promised change by West Virginia over and over with no action. And many of them wanted improvements, and so they came up with a list of 15 demands. Danny Lehman, Spider, the guy that painted that River Gorge bridge painting, he was actually one of the lead negotiators, him and Alvin Gregory. And they said, well, nothing's happening here until we see Governor Arch Moore. They want to negotiate. At the time, the museum was our law library, so when Governor Moore arrived the following day, they sat in there for only a couple hours because they only agreed on one of their 15 demands: a new dining hall, a cleaner dining hall, one that would replace this one, which would cost the state taxpayers over $3 million, but thankfully that is why the riot came to an end. The new dining hall opened in March of '87, so they worked on it pretty quickly. When that happened is when they threw these walls up and took what used to be a big open room and converted it into the layout we know it as today. So during those later years, this was contact visitation. You had tables in here. Inmates were allowed one hug, one kiss at the door with their loved ones. They were allowed to hold their visitors' hands from across the tables. That's all that was allowed. Inmates with acceptable behavior were allotted about 20 hours of visiting time each month. Usually they were allowed to do that on weekends or holidays, 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. When this became visitation is when they put the room in a corner that was bathrooms for inmates and visitors. Contrast from today's time, visitors have separate bathrooms from the inmates. Since we're all adults here, I'll just tell you that conjugal visits were not allowed here. When you got 15 or 20 inmates in here, each one of them has a couple visitors, one officer watching them. It's pretty easy for an inmate to go in there with a visitor. There's one inmate here, his name is Jesse. Jesse fathered 3 children in there that we know of. A few years ago, we had a guy come in here just a little bit older than me. We said, how'd you hear about us, to take a tour? He just flat out told us, he said, I was conceived in the bathroom over in the visiting area. So I walked up to him, I said, hey, I'll show you where your daddy lived, no judgment here, all right? But nonetheless, there were 3 guys who painted this room with the kids in mind. They didn't want them to be scared. I mean, it was scary for anyone, but the kids were confused. They don't know what's going on. It was noisy, smelly, and they wanted to be comfortable in here. And one of the guys that painted this room was colorblind. That's why the turtles are wearing the wrong color sashes and they got the wrong weapons in their hands. I'm no expert. I think Raphael should be Michelangelo, Leonardo should be Raphael. Gives you an idea. But now, back in 1987, a convicted sex offender, his name was Dale Bragg, he made this papier-mâché display here of the ancient Adena people, and they were the mound builders here in the Ohio Valley. That was over 2,000 years ago. But of course, given our namesake, pretty hard to miss that mound across from us when you roll up. That's the Grave Creek Mound. It's the largest mound of its kind in North America. Well, we brought it back here in the late 90s because over at the Archaeological Museum, they got tired of complaints from mostly parents and teachers about the nudity. Sure, we'll bring it back. That's history, it doesn't bother us. Trying to take care of it best we can. The little boy's faceless now because I had told them a little bit ago, but the state still owns the prison. And aside from the tours we do, they host a lot of training here for law enforcement, corrections, occasionally military. Well, over 20 years ago, two nights, the U.S. Marines were trained with night vision goggles here. And for some ungodly reason, a Marine was in that display when, in the darkness, he was startled by the little boy. As he reacted and spun around, the butt of that man's rifle took the face off the little boy. So they haven't invited those guys back, but what can you say? His U.S. Marine showed him his boss, so way it goes.
It seemed like a pretty reasonable accommodation that the prisoners were asking for a new dining area. I mean, that seemed reasonable. Of all the things they could have been asking for, that seemed reasonable.
Right, and certainly by Governor Moore's definition, I guess he thought that was the only reasonable one. But a lot of the other demands were reasonable. I mean, a couple of them weren't so much, but really, all in all, they were wanting just improvements. They wanted more access to religious. Like your segregated inmates in lockdown wanted more access to religious services, material, more sports equipment, stuff like that. The very first demand that was shouted, simply shouted through the window, a very informal demand. One of the inmates was shouting out to the news crews out there and said they wanted 3 things: pizza, beer, and women. Of course, they're not going to give them that, you know. Maybe some pizza, but nothing else. So, y'all have any questions?
I mean, I'd like to know more about the particularly buff uniform, but.
Right? That's the world's most muscular uniform, big bicep, beautiful eyelashes.
Buff uniform.
Yeah, what's not to love about that guy right there? Yeah.
It really adds to the ambiance.
Right, yeah. Yeah, we talk about prison uniforms and all of that, 3 of them. Here in a moment, another tour's going to pass by, so you'll see them pop around the corner here in a moment. Of course, you can tell this center block is modern, so this is not here. This is all wide open. From that wall all the way up to where the tile starts, that's where the tables were, gives you a better idea of massive. And from this wall west by Jefferson, the tile floor west was serving areas, so that's where they get their trays from the big warming ovens. And where the tile floor stops back there all the way back, and to the left of the new center block was the filthy kitchen. So they remodeled this into the main dining room hallway, MDR hallway. The door in the middle and the door behind me took you to the state shop where the clothes and beds were stored. And as I said earlier, we do make a loop on the north end, and as we make a loop, we'll come around that side, then you recognize where you are at that time. But hundreds of lessons were learned the hard way here over the years. Feeding as many as 300 at a time like they used to is not just easier, but certainly safer to feed them in smaller groups. So here in a moment, we'll see the new dining hall is built to feed about 120 every half hour. By design, smaller. How's it going? Now, if need be, they would form their pill line right here. You'd have an officer here with a radio, and there you had a nurse with the pill box and an officer with a shotgun. You had to watch them real close. A lot of the guys would hide under their tongues, called pocketing or cheeking, just another word for smuggling, basically. But they were required to shave here, so they had little cheap, little flimsy razor blades are issued. One of the inmates later was found to have taken his razor, and he made cuts on the insides of his mouth on either side. He shoved pencil erasers into the cuts to heal there. When they healed, he would remove the erasers. Now he formed pockets in his mouth big enough to hide pills in. They realized what he did. They had to send him to an oral surgeon and get him stitched up. But,
Wow.
Innovative.
yes, yeah. I mean, just ingenious stuff, But very desperate, but ingenious. But any jail or prison drugs are always been a problem. I think it's kind of pointless for them to watch him that close because they could have got any drug in here in a number of ways. So.
Ooh.
This is an active area times.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Especially back in the kitchen. Yeah, like I say, this was the main result of the '86 riot. Inmates appreciated the dining hall. They felt they put the effort in to acquire it through the uprising. Now, worthy of speaking of, this was the only area they had AC and heat. This one was nicer, 68 degrees. In the winter, the housing units could be as low as 45. The hottest recorded temperature was taken here in July on the 4th floor of a block at 130 degrees Fahrenheit. They did have death from heat over the years. But like I say, this was a comfortable area. And not just that, these guys ate pretty darn well in here. This is more like a full-service restaurant. You name it, they ate it in here. Pork chops, hot dogs, hamburgers, chicken wings, pasta, pizza at times, ham on Easter, Thanksgiving. They would cook at least 200 turkeys, so really not half bad. Now, cooking the food and serving the food would have been about 25 inmates in the kitchen. They're known as trustee honor inmates. They're your most well-behaved men on the prison. And contrary to popular belief, there wasn't a whole lot to worry about with the food that came out of there because it was a very desirable job on kitchen duty. Typically, they policed one another. And I was told a story one day, an inmate was cooking some soup, and a mouse ran by or something, and he found the mouse, threw it into the soup. The other guys watched him, started throwing things at him, skeletons and pans, whatnot, trying to hit him, you know, because it was an understood, unspoken thing for them, like, don't screw this up for us, you know. Because if one guy was found to have done something like that, jeopardizing his job, it would have put them all under more scrutiny and could have compromised someone else as well. That's actually why they built the diagonal wall in the corner, is many of the officers and staff here wanted to eat in here with the inmates and eat the same food. If you worked here, you're charged $1.05, and that was a bargain. You couldn't get a better meal in town cheaper than $1.05. The only reason they were behind that wall was that they didn't have 120 inmates here staring at them. You can imagine they're staring at them, back and forth. It's going to add to the tension over time. Keep them out of sight, out of mind. At an angle, you'll see the squares, which are where the stainless steel tables were bolted down, seats were bolted to the tables. Like I say, about half a cell block, 120 or so, were fed every half hour. They had their soup, salad, and fruit bar. They could help themselves all they wanted to that in the middle. They could only go through these lines once. The windows at the far ends are where they put their trays for the dishwashers. And an officer would have stood next to the door with a fork and spoon pan, collecting the silverware very carefully to make sure that the fork goes here, spoon goes here, counting them as they go along so that, you know, it's all accounted for. If y'all haven't seen it, you got to check out later after tour in the museum. We have a fork shank on display. Shows you how nasty of a weapon it can be turned into. And shows you some of them still yet got out of here with them. Now, there's a couple things I don't always tell people about, but since just a few of y'all here, I'll show you a couple of things over here. The guys that painted the visiting area we were in moments ago painted all this too. One of those guys, his name was Smitty Harding. He was a trucker on the highway Monday to Friday each week. Man, I got home late one Friday night. When he did, he said that his wife Sandy had nagged him, in his own words. He murders his wife. He dismembered her, put her in the deep well freezer. She stayed there for, I believe, at least a couple weeks till state troopers found her. His sentence was life without mercy, without possibility of parole. He was here in '95, transferred to the Mount Olive. He was still incarcerated about 6-7 years ago when he finally passed. But we speculate that truck is what his truck looked like. Now, they say that anytime Smitty was asked why he did that to his wife Sandy, I guess he would say the same thing. I love Sandy, but she shouldn't have nagged me. You know, so obviously he's where he needed to be. A good friend of mine, Maggie Gray, used to be a tour guide here, but more importantly, she was an officer here. And she told me she was working the floor in here one day when Smitty was in here eating, and she always seen this painting. 2 eagle wings and a heart, and it says Sandy. He bugged her, because she thought, why did he paint that since he killed her? Is he remorseful? So she flat out asked him. It made him mad. He stood up real fast, raised his voice. Officer in the gun room opened a porthole thinking he's about to do something to Maggie. She said, he said, I was on the highway all that week. All I wanted to do when I got home was have a beer and sit on the couch and watch the football game. Sandy wanted to go dancing. Sandy wanted to go shopping and to the cinema. And nag, 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 nag. You know, he's flailing about. She's taken aback by that, so she leans into him. She said, so you just killed her for it? He said, that's the only way I could shut her up. You think how unsettling that is. I mean, my personal opinion, it sounds like she was happy to see her husband, wanted to enjoy her husband's company before he's on the highway another 5 days. So he didn't care to think about how his wife felt. You know, it's kind of a sad story, but like I say, I always say he may have been a decent artist, just not a decent husband, you know, so. But,
Yeah, she was, you know, being a woman.
Yeah.
Wants to go do fun stuff.
Wanted to have a good time on the weekend, you know, and so, but one of just many, many thousands of guys that was in here and the kind of crimes committed, you know. And, but when they built all this dining hall.
Some of these pictures are really good.
Oh, gorgeous, gorgeous paintings. It's better than Bob Ross, a lot of them, if you ask me. You'll notice the square crack around this painting. It was up, over, down.
Yep.
This was the last section of wall filled in. They left this open as a way to bring equipment, supplies in through. So when they did fill this in, these cinder blocks were left totally hollow. Every other cinder block, solid concrete, which you can hear. The reason for that is if they ever had a riot again, they can knock that down and have a point of entry and try and rush the prison. Which to me, I think is fascinating. This is more so very telling of the conditions after the riot. Some things got better, of course they got this, but some things got worse after the riot. And in other words, it was conceivable another riot could occur. And the old saying of putting silk stockings on a hog, I think applies very much, here. Again, it just got to the point, they said, we just got to shut this place down, we couldn't, so, only so much they could do. And you think about it, when they have a chance to build a dining hall from the ground up, after the worst riot in state history, they put all their potential hostages in basically a blind corner. What do you think about it? And the only thing keeping them from going back there is a red line on the floor, and it says restricted area, like they're in here for all the rules anyway.
Were those the glass in there, or were those actually windows when it was operational?
It was exactly like that, kind of like a marble glass.
That's interesting. Yeah, it's like I wouldn't eat over it, I would be,
Right. Well, like I said, you had no more than about 20 back there, officers, staff, but 120 units.
Right.
I mean, if they wanted to go in there, it would go. It would have been all over with the shout. So, kind of interesting the way they did that. So. And don't get me wrong, it was fun. I'm glad I did it. For the sake of the story, it was a heck of an adrenaline rush, but it was fun but painful. They don't play around. I mean, they're rough with you, so. This is all the north yard, the original prison yard. Now everything started here, over at the wagon gate, which kind of resembles a church steeple. That is from 1866. Now the first 100 inmates lived in there back then like sardines, but they would be the ones that would build all this. All the original sandstone you see, every block was cut, beveled, and laid by convicts' hands. And they loosely modeled this prison after our sister prison, Joliet Penitentiary, up in Illinois. That was featured at the beginning of Blues Brothers with Dan Aykroyd, John Belushi. Joliet and Moundsville are both gorgeous examples of Gothic revival style architecture, resembling a castle with the embattlements and turrets and crenellations. And now, until 1960, the third and fourth floor was the home of the warden and his families, and that was seemingly a normal life for them. I've heard stories of him allowing his kids, the little wardens, come out here with the inmates, and never any trouble out of it either. Until 1960, the second floor, that would have been administrative offices for the warden and his deputy warden, the magistrate, the records office, prison clerk, the ombudsman had an office up there as well. So, now the first floor was the closest that they had to a lobby in the early years, and we'll be in there here before terribly long, so I'll kind of hold off on that now until we're inside. What we call the Blue Building was known as State Industries, and that was constructed in 1972. A couple hundred of the mainline inmates had jobs in there in factory workshops. Everything from welding and electrical work to photography shop and automotive garage, and a tag factory for license plates and highway signs.
Oh.
Back in 1982, they had most of the plates coming out a little bit yellow. They asked them over and over what the problem was, and they gave them every excuse under the sun. They said, well, the paint's faulty, the paint's defective. Well, they were peeing in the paint. And the reason they were urinating in the paint was the inmates were clever enough to realize the ammonia in their urine would gradually cause those plates to crack and peel from the sun. Well, those same guys made piecework. So they realized the more pea plates they make, that's their job security, because they're going to have to make more new ones. So, you know.
They kind of had an entrepreneurial spirit about them.
Yes, yes. Well,
Job
and, you
security.
know, there's a notion about inmates being dumb, and I say they make dumb choices. You know, because they all have the mental capacity and the intelligence.
Right.
They could have done something more productive with their lives, you know.
Correct, yeah.
But yeah, we have one of those plates in the museum. Y'all got to check it out here in a little while. Like I said, we call them P plates. Nowadays, there's some training offices and classrooms in there. The rest of that building is our event center. You name it, we got it in there. Small scale concerts, MMA fights, gun shows, class reunions. And my personal favorite, weddings. Honestly, we had a wedding here a few weeks ago. 2 or 3 couples get married here each year, and some people say, oh, that's too weird. That's crossing the line. I don't. I personally cannot think of a better place to receive my life sentence. I got a lot of cheesy dad jokes.
I'm here for it.
Now you'll notice the base of the walls, just about everything's painted white, because in 1980, the inmates started wearing khaki uniforms and they more easily camouflaged into the wall. They knew all too well about escapes because they had around 500 of them. Got them all back but a couple, and that's the only saving grace to that, but nothing but time to plan, you know, nothing to lose by trying to get out.
Yep.
They had a couple tunnel escapes. Times they would steal trucks and drive out. They would tie uniforms and bed sheets together to make ropes to try and climb over the 24-foot walls. It's crazy. Plus, this side of Moundsville in town grew up around the pen's walls. People ask about that often because it is strange looking. But when you think about it, even in a mass escape, the neighbors are the safest people in the Ohio Valley because they're not going to hang out next door for long, you know. They're going to gain ground as fast as they can to get out of Dodge. So, now right here on your all's left-hand side, these fences we call bullpens. Now if you take the size of these 2 bullpens and square them and picture a 2-story white building here, that was the old death house where the executions were held. Built in 1899 at the cost of $7,000. Now a very strange thing to know about that is until June 19th of 1931, you could have came here on the day of a hanging. You'd walk through the north wagon gate with your kids in the picnic basket. You're charged no more than $2 a head. You could go in there and watch a hanging. Yeah, Moundsville newspaper used to advertise the hangings. A buddy of mine has a copy of one of those advertisements, and it read exactly like this. Pack a picnic. Bring your family to the state pen. Enjoy a nice hanging. Well, what brought all that to an end in June of 31 was the execution of Frank Heyer, who had beat his wife to death with a bat. He was described as being a big little man. He was 5'8", weighed over 350 pounds. Well, when a hanging's done correctly, the rope is measured on a calculation of their height and weight. Well, his rope was too long. He instantly decapitated as soon as the doors opened. Some people argue that they got their money's worth that day. I don't know so much about that. I do know I've heard that some of the people in the front row were very upset by that. That put an end to tickets being sold. After that, executions were by invitation only, so you'd have to be related to that inmate, you know, the condemned, or be related to the victim or a member of the media otherwise to have access to all that. Now, back in 1938, they had the first ever and only triple hanging here, which made Life magazine news. Arnett Booth, John Travis, and Orville Atkins, all 3 had kidnapped the minister and left him in an old coal mine, and he developed pneumonia and passed away. So the 3 of them are sentenced to death for kidnapping and manslaughter convictions. Their feet are tied together by their ankles, their hands tied behind their back. The noose is already over Arnett and John's necks. But when they went to slide the noose over Orville's neck, the drop doors he was standing on broke open prematurely. Of course, he falls through, broke the leg he landed on, some ribs and a collarbone. Very injured and still alive, but laying there looking up at the officers. They're up there on the gallows gazing down at him for an awkward few moments. They're thinking, my God, racking their brain, right? They've never seen such a thing. How do we handle this and be civil? Well, they grabbed a gurney. They walked down the 13 steps. They very carefully strapped Mr. Atkins to the gurney. They carried him back up and continued to hang him the right way. Not a lot of mercy back here in those days, you know. A few years ago, I had an officer on tour. I forget which state he worked in, but it was a state with the death penalty in effect. And he told me they had an inmate who woke up on his day of execution complaining of a headache. They postponed it for him. So, see, nowadays you got to feel well to die. But like I say, not in Moundsville 100 years ago. But they tore the death house out in 1967, 2 years after the abolition of the death penalty here. And I'll tell you about the bullpens here in just a second. There's something right next to the wagon gate I'd like for y'all to get to see first. Now you'll see that small blue building right there. That used to be a 2-story brick building that would have housed around 100 female inmates. at least till 1947, during the years that this pen was co-ed. Not just men and women, but children over the years, as young as 12 was incarcerated here. Now, people often ask, who was the most infamous inmate ever here in Moundsville? Now, my personal opinion, it was one of the ladies, Kathleen Maddox. Now, by chance, do y'all recognize the name Kathleen Maddox? Now, I'm sure you've heard of her son, Charlie Manson.
Yeah.
Charlie Manson's mom, Kathleen, and his uncle Luther were both here because back in 1942, they robbed a gas station in Charleston with a broken ketchup bottle. Well, got him a few years in here for strong arm robbery. He's about 8 years of age at the time, growing up river in McMecken with his aunt Glenna. Coming here a lot to visit his mom. On YouTube, there's an interview of him in San Quentin. I think it's a Tom Snyder interview, I can't remember. Anyhow, at one point they say, Charlie, tell us about your mother. And he kind of, livens up and says, my mother is the icebox, my mother's the penitentiary. And I guess that's his thought association. When he thought of his mother, he's seen this place in his mind's eye. He still has family not too far away, so back in March of 1983, he's at Vacaville, and he wrote a letter to the warden, Donald Bordenkircher, the warden here, requesting transfer here to be close to his people. And we have a copy of that in the museum. Now, Bordenkircher had a reputation as a tough guy and a tough talker. Very firm, but very fair. If you ask me, probably one of the better wardens they had. Well, in true fashion, Bordenkircher responded to Charlie with a letter. Dear Charlie, when hell freezes over. Signed, Donald Bordenkircher. No favors for him. Actually, before Charlie moved out west, him and Rosalie Willis were married at the Episcopal Church up in McMecken. At home, I got a copy of their marriage certificate. So we got a lot of weird Manson trivia around here. So, ladies were sent downstate in 1947 to a prison called prison in Pence Springs, women's prison. So, what we have there now is the Old Man's Colony, or OMC for short. Any inmate 65 and older that had trouble walking or serious ailments would live in there. It's basically a dormitory. It's a safe area. Keep them away from the young guys that could, do something to them. They used to have an electric fence up right there, not to keep them in, but more so to keep others from getting to them. Now, when the place closed in '95, the youngest guy that walked out of there was 76, and the oldest inmate was a 92-year-old man. His name was Freeman Collins. In the horseshoe hallway in our lobby, the visitors hallway is an extension of our museum. You got to check it out. We have some articles and photos of him. Spent, I think it was at least about around 60 years in prison. Sadly, not much of a life, I've been working here about 7 years. I've been visiting the prison over 15. And had I been more diligent years ago, keeping a diary, by now I could have written a book on everything I've experienced in here. And God is my witness. I would tell you all that here or at Buffalo Wild Wings. In other words, I'm not just saying it because I'm doing a tour. God's truth, day and night. It doesn't matter what time of day. I mean, I've seen one full-bodied apparition. I've seen a half-bodied apparition. A man had no legs. He was floating through the main hallway. I've seen shadows countless times. I've been touched more times than I can remember. I've heard voices, recorded voices, doors slamming, running, footsteps. I've always said I'm more afraid of the living than the dead. And some of that has happened to me, whether it's I'm by myself in here 3 p.m. or 3 a.m. Or maybe I'm with someone else, but not always. So certainly at 3 or 4 in the morning, you're the only one in here and you know it. And you start hearing men talking and you hear doors slamming and running. That puts the hair up pretty fast on the back of your neck. So I go into security mode thinking, oh Lord, did I forget to lock a door, I'll do the checks and I make sure everything's locked, and I'm actually, it's reassuring. It's like, oh, it's just a spirit, right? Like I say, this is their home, not mine. But, oh yeah, they're here. Our death record started in 1920. Well, like I say, you came to the right place. It's, the first 54 years of operation, all the deaths were really fell to the wayside and, got lost through the cracks of history, so to speak. The last 75 years of the operation is what we have documentation for. From 1920 to 1995, there were 998 deaths on this property. The executions are a part of that. Obviously, the bulk of that is natural death. But about 47 suicides, about 36 homicides. Now, that are reported. And last year I looked at those deaths, and a little over 100, about 14% of them, no cause of death was listed. So if you ask me, I could go into that for a while. I personally think there was more murders than what happened here. Probably suicides that were, 998 that we know of. Undocumented deaths, 300 to 400 that we figure, at least. And that may not sound like a lot for a place like this, but everyone always thinks, big bad violent prison is Alcatraz. I mean, everyone's heard of it. Now, it was maximum security prison, but it was federal. Now, it was only open 36 years. They had 28 deaths. You had some pretty nasty guys out there at Alcatraz, but they had it easy compared to what the men here in Moundsville had.